Mary Lane slipped the blue ribbon into Samuel Frost's hymn book while the congregation was still standing. Before anyone could notice, the book had never been opened. She laid it between the pages of Abide with Me, closed the cracked black cover, and returned it to the corner of the back pew where Samuel always sat. He entered as Reverend Moore finished the opening prayer. At 59, Samuel still had a rancher's broad shoulders and work-worn hands, but when the first hymn began, those hands rested motionless on his knees. 3 years earlier, his deep voice had carried half the congregation. Since his wife's burial, he had not sung a word. Mary took her place at the small reed organ. Samuel stood when everyone stood. He faced the hymn board. He did not touch the book. Halfway through the second verse, two children near the front lost the melody. Mary softened the organ, lifted her voice enough to give them the correct line, then brought the keys back beneath the congregation before anyone turned to stare. The children found their place and sang on. That was how Mary preferred to help people without making their weakness the price of her usefulness. After the benediction, she began collecting loose hymnals for repair. Samuel had already reached the door. "Mr. Frost," she called, "you left your book." He paused. "It belongs to the church. You use the same one every Sunday." A small movement crossed his face, almost a smile and almost pain. "Then I reckon it knows where to wait." He stepped outside before she could answer. Mrs. Pritchard watched him cross the churchyard. "You mark that man's pages like he might suddenly remember how to read them," she said. "Some doors stay shut because the Lord meant them to." Mary lifted Samuel's book from the pew. The new ribbon showed beneath the cover, bright against the worn leather. Beneath it, the spine bulged slightly from older markers she had tucked there Sunday after Sunday and never asked him to acknowledge. "Then it will do no harm to leave a light near the threshold." Mrs. Pritchard sighed and moved away. Daniel Kerr, Bitter Creek's new schoolmaster, had heard them. He was 34, careful with his words, and respected because he kept clean cuffs and paid every debt. He waited until they were alone. "You knew those children would lose the second verse," he said. "They had practiced it only once. And you changed the music before anyone heard them fail? Children sing better when they are not afraid of being heard. So do grown people, I expect." His glance moved toward the closed church door. Daniel helped her carry the hymnals to the work table beside the organ. Several needed new thread. Samuel's book needed more. Its spine had begun to split, and the cover no longer closed evenly. Daniel laid an envelope beside it. Mary recognized the county seal and felt the room grow smaller around the offer. "The winter school outside North Platte needs someone to teach music and assist with the younger pupils," he said. "It is paid work." Mary looked at the envelope but did not touch it. "I recommended you. You had no permission." "No, but I had evidence." He nodded toward the ordered books and the children outside, still humming the melody she had restored. "The train leaves Monday morning after Founders Sunday," he continued. "That gives you 21 days. Mary's hand rested on Samuel's closed hymn book. Daniel's voice softened. "And if you chose to go, I would be glad to court you openly." Outside, wagon wheels passed over the hard Nebraska road. Samuel was already gone. 3 Sundays remained, and for the first time, Mary understood that the ribbon inside his book might be marking the end of something instead of the beginning. By Wednesday, frost had silvered the churchyard grass, and Samuel Frost's wagon stood beside the woodshed before Mary arrived. He had already unloaded half the split cottonwood, stacking it beneath the lean-to where blowing snow could not reach it. Mary carried a basket of torn hymnals through the side door. "You came early," she said. Samuel set another armful against the wall. "Cold weather generally does." "That is not what I meant." "I know." He took the basket from her hands and carried it inside. The church smelled of pine, lamp oil, and the ashes Mary had banked beneath the stove after Sunday service. Samuel stirred the coals while she spread the damaged books across the work table. One cover had come loose. Another had lost 6 pages. Mary matched each tier with linen thread, paste, or backing cloth. Beside every repaired book, she placed a small paper mark showing its number and pew. Samuel watched her fit a page into place. "You keep account of all of them." "I keep account of who needs them." She pointed toward a large print hymnal. "That one belongs near Mrs. Talbot. She cannot read the smaller type, though she would rather miss every verse than admit it." Samuel glanced toward the front pew. "And the one with the red thread?" For Ben Carter, he knows the tunes but not the numbers. Red is easier for him to find. Samuel adjusted the stove damper before the room grew too warm. Mary had not asked him. She noticed anyway. He crossed to the rear pew and tightened the loose brace beneath the seat. The hammer blows were measured, never loud enough to jar the lamps. Mary opened a child's hymnal and threaded her needle. For a while, the church held only the scrape of tools and the quiet snap of the stove. Then Mary said, "Do you remember the bass line of Abide With Me?" Samuel's hammer stopped. "I remember enough to sing it." He drove the next nail too hard, enough to know when somebody else misses it. Mary drew the thread through the binding. "That seems a waste of good memory." Samuel set the hammer down. "Some things are better left where they were." Mary trimmed the thread and placed the repaired book in its proper stack. Outside, wind pressed against the windows. Samuel lowered the damper another notch before the heat could redden Mary's face. Again, she had not asked. The kindness of it made his silence harder to excuse. When the work was finished, Mary carried Samuel's black hymn book to the rear pew. Its cracked spine had swollen so much that the cover no longer lay flat. "You should let me mend this one," she said. "It is still holding together, barely. That makes two of us." The words escaped before he could take them back. Mary looked at him. Samuel reached for his coat. From the front steps came Daniel Kerr's voice. He was speaking with Reverend Moore about the Founder's Supper and had offered to escort Mary there. Samuel's face closed at once. "You ought to go," he said. "A schoolmaster is respectable company." Mary placed the book in his hands. "I did not ask what sort of company he was." Samuel held her gaze only a moment. Then he set the book back on the pew rather than carry it home. After Mary and Daniel left, he returned for the gloves he had forgotten. The church had gone dim. Evening light crossed the rear pew and touched the hymn book's split cover. Samuel picked it up. Several faded blue fibers showed beneath the loosened leather, too many to belong to Sunday's ribbon. He pressed his thumb against the swollen cover. The book opened less than an inch. Samuel closed it again. Sunday opened under a pale sky, with the church windows filmed by cold and the organ reeds stiff from the night air. Mary arrived early to warm the bellows and test each stop. She found Samuel's hymn book where he had left it, closed on the rear pew. The cover still bulged. She placed a fresh blue ribbon at Abide With Me, then moved to the organ before anyone saw her hand linger. By the opening hymn, every bench was filled. Reverend Moore announced that Founders Sunday would come in 2 weeks and asked the congregation to sing generously in preparation. Mary set her fingers to the keys. The first verse held. On the second, the middle reed stuck. A sharp note cut across the melody and would not release. Several people stopped singing. A child laughed nervously. "Mrs.?" Pritchard turned as though the organ had committed an offense. Mary lifted both hands. "Keep your books open," she said. The room obeyed. She stepped beside the instrument, gave the altos a lower starting note, and nodded to the children. "Begin with me." Mary sang without accompaniment. The children followed. When the men came in too high, she lowered the next phrase and marked the beat with 2 fingers against the organ case. The congregation found the tune again. At the back, Samuel stood with his hymn book closed. His mouth moved on the last words, though no sound reached the pew ahead. Mary saw it and did not look twice. They finished without the organ. After the service, Reverend Moore pressed the stubborn key. "It may need a new reed." "It needs cleaning first," Mary said. Dust caught beneath the tongue. "I can free it before next Sunday." He glanced around at the people still discussing the hymn. "You did more than free a reed today. I want you to direct the Founders' Sunday music. Choose the hymns, arrange the voices, put people where they can do their best." Mrs. Pritchard looked surprised. Mary held a stack of books against her chest. "I will need the children Thursday and the adults after Saturday prayer. You shall have them." The first rehearsal began that afternoon. Mary placed strong singers beside uncertain ones instead of gathering the best voices at the front. She moved Ben Carter near a man who knew every number. She gave the children the melody and asked the women to carry the middle line. Samuel remained by the doorway, claiming he had come only to return a borrowed wood plane. Mary handed the men a verse in a lower key. "Mr. Frost, you may stand with them. I am not rehearsing. Then you may listen accurately." A few men smiled, but no one laughed. Mary gave the note. Samuel's lips shaped the bass line. On the final phrase, a low sound escaped him, barely more than breath. But true to the cord, the man beside him turned. Samuel reached for his coat. Mary continued as if nothing had happened. Naming a fragile thing too quickly could frighten it back into hiding. When the last family left, Reverend Moore stopped beside her. The church sounded fuller today than it has in years. They listened to one another. They listened to you. It was the first time anyone in Bitter Creek had spoken of her work as something beyond willingness. Daniel entered carrying an envelope and a folded railway card. The county board approved the appointment. He laid both on the organ bench. The position would begin the Tuesday after Founders Sunday. Lodging would be provided beside the schoolhouse. The wage was modest, but it was hers. Daniel touched the railway card. One seat. Monday morning. I can release it if you decide against the post. Mary looked toward the rear pew. Samuel had returned silently for his hymn book. He stood in the doorway with the cracked cover beneath one hand, his eyes fixed on the appointment letter. 14 days remained. He carried the book to the church steps, set it on the railing, and walked into the cold without it. Daniel's offer waited on the organ bench, while Samuel was forced to see that Mary's life had begun opening somewhere he might not be invited to follow. Saturday brought a thin, colorless sun and a wind that worried every loose board on the church. Samuel arrived carrying a length of seasoned oak for the warped music stand. Mary was already inside, testing the Founders' Sunday hymns one by one. She had taken the organ apart far enough to clean the stubborn reed, and now its voice sounded clear again, though the bellows complained whenever she pressed too hard. Samuel set the oak across two chairs. Reverend says this stand leans worse than a tired fence post. It has been leaning since spring. Then it has shown uncommon patience. Mary looked over her shoulder. Perhaps it hoped someone would notice. Samuel bent to his work without answering. She returned to the hymn. The children would open with a simple melody. The women would carry the second line. The men needed a lower arrangement than the printed key allowed, so Mary played it once, then again, searching for the place where their voices would settle without strain. Samuel shaved a narrow curl from the oak. "Too high," he said. Mary stopped. "You were not rehearsing?" "I was listening accurately." She lowered the key and began again. This time, Samuel hummed the first bass note before he seemed to realize he had done it. The sound was low and rough from disuse, but it filled the empty church more completely than the organ had. Mary kept playing. He followed 3 notes, then 4. When she reached the final line, his voice strengthened enough to carry the harmony beneath hers. Mary lifted her hands from the keys. The last note remained between them. Samuel stared at the strip of oak in his hands. "You remembered all of it," she said. His jaw tightened. "I said I remembered enough." "You remembered enough to make the room sound whole." He set the wood down too quickly. "Do not make more of it than it was." Mary rose from the bench. "I did not make it anything." He reached for his coat. That was when her patience changed shape. For 3 years, she had guarded every silence around him. She had stopped questions before they reached him, softened hymns that might wound him, and marked the same page without asking him to open it. She would not apologize now because one honest sentence had frightened him. Samuel paused at the rear pew. His black hymn book rested where Mary had placed it after rehearsal. The cracked spine had pulled farther from the cover. "You should let me repair that before Sunday," she said. He looked at the book, then at the work table where her needles and linen thread lay waiting. Without a word, he carried it forward. Mary loosened the leather carefully. Samuel stood beside her while she lifted the inner lining. The first ribbon slipped free and fell across the table. Then another. 3 more followed. Samuel reached for the book as the loosened cover opened fully. Blue ribbons spilled across the floor. Some were still bright. Others had faded almost gray. Several had curled at the ends. One was frayed so badly that only a narrow thread of blue remained. Samuel did not move. Mary knelt to gather them. He lowered himself beside her and picked up a ribbon worn soft with age. "How many?" "1 each Sunday." "For how long?" Mary placed another in her palm. "You know how long?" His face changed as he counted without numbers. Winter ribbons, summer ribbons, straight ribbons, faded ribbons. 3 years of Sundays hidden beneath a cover he had refused to open. All the same hymn. Most weeks, Rachel's hymn. Yes, Samuel sat back on his heels. Mary did not tell him that his wife's memory had never been the obstacle. She did not tell him she had marked the page because Samuel once led that verse so steadily that frightened people found courage inside his voice. She waited. He held the oldest ribbon between both hands. You kept doing this when I gave you nothing back. I was not keeping account. That does not mean there was no cost. Mary looked at him. For one moment, she thought he would finally say what the ribbons had made him understand. Instead, he lowered his eyes. I am sorry. It was sincere. It was also not enough. Mary rose and placed the gathered ribbons on the table. Reverend Moore entered carrying the final program sheets. Daniel followed with the appointment letter tucked beneath his arm. Mary looked once at Samuel. Then she turned to the Reverend. Founders Sunday will be my last service in Bitter Creek. Daniel remained silent. Samuel stood slowly. Mary took the appointment letter and signed beneath the county seal. I will accept the position provisionally, she said. The train leaves the next morning. The church bell began its Saturday hour above them. Samuel stayed beside the open hymn book while Mary crossed the room to discuss the final rehearsal. 7 days remained. In his hand, the faded blue ribbons trembled with every strike of the bell. Grief can make silence feel loyal, as though speaking again would erase the one who is gone. Yet sometimes the truest memory is not the quiet we keep, but the life we allow to return. Have you ever mistaken holding back for honoring what you loved? By Saturday afternoon, sleet had turned the church roof white and glazed the road from Bitter Creek with ice. Mary had gone back for the Founders Sunday programs when the south window gave way. The first pane cracked under a hard gust. The second burst inward, scattering glass across the rear pews and driving freezing rain through the opening. Mary dropped the programs and ran for the hymnals. Water struck the back benches in slanting sheets. She gathered 3 books against her chest, carried them to the front, then returned for the rest while sleet rattled across the floorboards. Samuel's black hymn book lay on the corner of the rear pew. A gust caught its loosened cover before Mary reached it. The book fell open into the aisle. Blue ribbons scattered over the wet boards. Mary knelt at once. One ribbon clung to a splinter. Another floated in a shallow line of meltwater running toward the wall. The oldest markers darkened at their frayed edges as she pressed them between her palms. The church door opened against the wind. Samuel stepped inside, carrying a coil of rope and a square of canvas. He took in the broken window, the wet hymnals, and Mary kneeling over the ribbons. He crossed the aisle without removing his coat. Move them near the stove, he said. Not too close. Mary gathered the ribbons while Samuel dragged the rear pew aside. He nailed the canvas over the empty frame, but the wind tore one corner loose before he reached the second nail. He braced the cloth with his shoulder. Rope, Mary said. She looped it through the iron hooks beside the window and pulled until the canvas held tight enough to stop the rain. Samuel drove the final nails through the trembling edge. By the time the opening was covered, water had soaked through Mary's skirt below the knees. Samuel fed cottonwood into the stove. Your hands, they still work. They are bleeding. A thin cut crossed her palm where broken glass had caught her. Samuel handed her a clean handkerchief. Mary wrapped it once, tied it with her teeth, and carried the damaged hymnals to the front table. Together they separated wet pages with scraps of unused program paper. Samuel placed thin boards beneath warped covers. Mary arranged the books by damage, saving those that could still be used Sunday, and setting the worst beside the stove to dry slowly. His own hymn book had swollen at the lower corner. The cracked leather was dark with water. Several pages had buckled, and blue dye from one ribbon had bled faintly onto the margin beside Rachel's hymn. Samuel touched the stain with one finger. It will never look the same. No, Mary said, but it may still open. He looked at her, then began smoothing each ribbon across the work table. The storm pressed harder against the canvas. Somewhere above them, a loose shingle scraped back and forth. Mary crossed to the organ. If the room stays damp overnight, the bellows may swell. She opened the lower panel. Cold air had reached the leather folds, leaving droplets along the wood. Samuel brought lamp cloths while she wiped the mechanism and worked the pedals gently. The first breath sounded weak. The second produced a strained chord. Again Samuel asked. Mary pressed more carefully. The bellows rose, hesitated, then split with a dry crack. Air rushed uselessly through the tear. The organ gave one broken note and fell silent. Samuel crouched beside her. Can it be patched? Not before morning. Outside, the bell rope beat against the tower in the wind. Mary looked at the damp hymnals, the soaked programs, and the torn bellows that had been meant to carry every voice through her final service. Samuel waited for her to speak. She closed the organ panel. "We saved the books," he said. "We saved enough of them. And the church will be standing." Yes, but without the organ, Founders Sunday would depend on people who had never trusted their own voices. Led by a woman half the town still called sentimental, Mary turned toward the rows of empty pews. Less than a day remained, and there would be no instrument between her and every silence in Bitter Creek. By dawn, the sleet had hardened into a clear skin across the church steps. Mary arrived before the sun reached the cottonwoods. The broken south window was still covered by Samuel's canvas, stiff now with frozen rain. Inside, the stove had gone low, and the damp hymnals stood open along the front pews like tired wings. She removed her gloves and tested the organ once. Air hissed through the torn bellows. No note came. Reverend Moore entered carrying 2 lanterns. Daniel followed with a box of candles and found Mary at the organ bench, her cut palm newly wrapped. "Do we postpone?" the Reverend asked. Mary looked toward the rows of pews. "People crossed farther roads than this to build the church." "That is not an answer. It is mine." She closed the organ lid. "We hold the service." Daniel set down the candles, without accompaniment, with memory. Mary began by rewriting the program. She removed the most difficult hymn and moved Abide with Me to the end. She marked the children's opening melody in large pencil strokes, then placed stronger singers beside those likely to lose the line. When the first families arrived for rehearsal, she did not explain what had failed. She gave them work. "Mrs. Talbot, stand with the younger women. Ben, take the aisle seat where you can see my hand. Children, listen for my first breath, not for an instrument." Daniel took the tenor line. Reverend Moore carried a steady middle note. Twice the congregation drifted sharp, and twice Mary stopped them before embarrassment became fear. "Lower," she said. "Do not reach for the hymn. Let it come where your voices already are." They began again. The third attempt held. Samuel entered through the side door with a warped hymn book wrapped beneath his coat. He had dried the leather overnight and stitched the cracked spine with dark wax thread. The repair was rough but strong. The water stain remained across the lower corner, and the blue mark beside Rachel's hymn had spread into the paper like a small evening shadow. He set the book on Mary's work table. Every old ribbon lay beneath the inner cover, flattened and secured by a narrow strip of cloth. One surviving ribbon, still blue at its center, marked Abide with Me. "You saved all of them," Mary said. "I nearly lost them by refusing to look." The room emptied around them as people carried candles and dry books into place. Samuel touched the repaired spine. Rachel used to say a hymn was not a grave marker. Mary waited. She said it was a road people walked together. His hand closed against the book. "I made hers into a door and stood behind it so long I forgot there were people on the other side." Mary's voice stayed quiet. "I could not open it for you." "No." He looked at the wrapped cut on her palm. "But you kept me from boarding it shut." For 3 years, Mary had been told she was sentimental, patient beyond reason, too willing to give where nothing returned. Samuel's words did not repay those years. They did something harder and cleaner. They named them truthfully. She placed the hymn book in his hands. "Will you sing?" Samuel looked toward the sanctuary. "I do not know." Mary's face tightened, but she nodded. "Then do not promise what fear may take back." He accepted the boundary without protest. "What can I do?" "Carry that book yourself. Stand where you choose. If you sing, let it be because you are ready to be heard." Samuel left to help Reverend Moore clear ice from the front steps. Mary finished preparing the room. Daniel checked the candles. The children practiced their opening note under their breath. Dry hymnals were distributed among families, and the damaged ones remained open near the stove. The bell rang once above the frozen yard. Then again, people entered stamping ice from their boots. Every bench filled. Mrs. Pritchard sat where she could see the silent organ and, for once, offered no opinion. Mary stood before the congregation without a keyboard, music stand, or instrument between them. She looked toward the rear. Samuel's repaired hymn book was not on the pew. Neither was Samuel. Reverend Moore gave the opening prayer. Mary lifted both hands to begin the first unaccompanied hymn and found his place in the back row empty. The first note left Mary's mouth alone. It was clear, low enough for the children and steady enough for the women to follow. For one measure, the congregation held. Then the men entered too high. The second line tightened. A child glanced toward the silent organ. Mrs. Talbot lost the word at the end of the phrase, and uncertainty passed through the room faster than sound. Mary did not stop them. She lowered her hand. Take the next line where you can carry it, she said. She gave the note again, softer this time. Daniel found the tenor beneath her. Reverend Moore held the middle. The children entered together, and the hymn settled into a key that belonged to the people singing it instead of the page before them. By the final verse, the room no longer sounded frightened. Mary let her hands fall. No one applauded. They simply turned the page when she asked them to. That obedience meant more. The second hymn began stronger. Ben Carter watched Mary's fingers and entered on time. Mrs. Talbot sang from the large print book without pretending she could see the smaller one. The children stopped searching for the missing organ and listened to one another. Mary guided them through every rough place. Still, the rear pew remained empty. Between hymns, wind pressed against the frozen canvas over the broken window. The cloth bowed inward, then held. Damp pages near the stove curled at their corners. Mary looked once toward the door. It did not open. Abide With Me waited at the bottom of the program. She had placed it last because every other hymn could prepare the room for it. Now each finished verse brought her closer to the one she had marked for 3 years, and might have to lead without the man whose voice had once carried it. When the final prayer before the closing hymn ended, Mary faced the congregation. Some books opened to the proper page. Others did not. Several people knew the number only because she had written it large on the board. Mary raised her hand. The rear door opened. Cold air moved down the aisle. Samuel stood in the vestibule with a repaired hymn book beneath one arm. Ice whitened the shoulders of his coat, and his breath showed in the doorway. He had been clearing the eastern road where a wagon had slid across the church approach. 2 families entered behind him, safe and late. Samuel closed the door. For a moment, he remained beside the back pew. Then he looked at Mary. He carried the hymn book forward 1 row, then another. The stitched spine bent in his hands. The water stain showed dark against the leather. When he opened the cover, the old ribbons rested beneath the cloth strip, faded and preserved. 1 blue ribbon marked Rachel's hymn. Samuel stopped in the center aisle where Mary could see him clearly. She gave the opening note. The women followed. The first line trembled, but held. On the second, Samuel lowered his eyes to the page. His mouth opened. The sound came rough at first, more breath than music. Then his deep bass found the line beneath Mary's voice and steadied there. People turned, but Samuel did not stop. He sang the full verse. The church changed around that sound. Men who had been reaching too high settled into his pitch. The children followed Mary without fear. Mrs. Talbot lifted her head from the page. Mary kept her hands moving, though tears blurred the last measure. Samuel did not sing loudly to prove anything. He sang as a man stepping back onto a road he had once mistaken for a grave. When the hymn ended, the silence was not empty. Reverend Moore closed his book. Miss Lane, he said, this church has treated your labor as kindness when it should have recognized it as leadership. He named a regular stipend from the church fund and asked her to direct the Sunday music through winter and beyond. Mary looked across the room. No one objected. Mrs. Pritchard moved her own hymnal to the place Mary had marked for the next service. Daniel folded the railway card and slipped it into his coat without resentment. Samuel closed his book, but he did not return to the rear pew. After the benediction, families gathered their coats and moved toward the door. Samuel waited until Mary had put away the last program. Then he stepped beside her with the scarred hymn book in his hands. Miss Lane, he said, within hearing of Reverend Moore, Daniel, and half the departing congregation, may I walk you home? Mary looked at Samuel's scarred hymn book, then at the people pretending not to listen. You may, she said. They stepped into the cold together. The storm had left every fence wire shining. Their boots broke the thin crust over the road, and for the first 100 yards, Samuel said nothing. He carried the book beneath his coat, protecting the warped leather from the wind. Mary did not rescue him from the silence. At the turn toward her cottage, Samuel stopped. I know 1 verse does not settle 3 years. No, and I know asking you to stay now could sound like fear of losing what I would not claim. It could. He accepted that without flinching. I will not ask you to refuse good work because I finally found my voice. Mary watched him closely. Samuel opened the hymn book. The repaired thread crossed its spine in dark, uneven stitches. Beneath the cover lay the faded ribbons, their edges curled and stained. "I would like to walk with you again next Sunday," he said. "I would like to haul the church wood before you need to ask, help mend what the storm damaged, and stand somewhere other than the last pew." A faint smile touched Mary's mouth. "That sounds like several promises. It sounds like work." "That is better." He closed the book carefully. "And if you still choose the train, I will carry your trunk to it. I have no right to make your future the price of forgiving my past." Mary had waited years to hear him choose her. What moved her now was that he had finally learned not to make the choice for her. Morning light flashed across the frozen schoolhouse steps when Mary met Daniel and returned the railway card. "The position is honorable," she told him. "So was your offer." Daniel studied her face, then nodded. "You are staying for Mr. Frost?" "I am staying because the church has offered me work that bears my name and wages that recognize it. Mr. Frost has asked for a walk, not my surrender." Daniel smiled, though sadness remained in it. "Then I hope he keeps pace." Mary offered him her hand. "Thank you for seeing work where others saw sentiment. You made it difficult not to." Snow rose along the church fence, hardened beneath wagon wheels, and slowly sank under longer afternoons. Mary directed the Sunday music. Samuel repaired the broken window frame, carried wood, and sat 3 rows from the front. Some weeks his voice was strong, some weeks it failed after a verse. He came back the following Sunday either way. The congregation learned to follow Mary's hands rather than wait for an instrument. Mrs. Talbot used the large print hymnal openly. Ben Carter no longer hid his red markers. When spring softened the Bitter Creek Road, Samuel walked Mary home without asking whether the town approved. He spoke of Rachel without closing afterward. Mary spoke of the years she had felt foolish, and he listened without defending the silence that had caused them. On the first warm Sunday, Samuel placed the repaired hymn book on the organ bench before service. The old ribbons remained beneath its scarred cover. A fresh blue ribbon rested between the pages. Mary opened the book. Samuel stood beside her as the congregation rose. This time, the blue ribbon marked a hymn they opened together.